Welcome to the debate. The Algerian War really shattered the moral certainty of post-war France. It forced its intellectual elite, everyone from the left to the right, to confront a truly impossible choice. This brutal colonial conflict, running from 1954 to 1962, it just redefined what it even meant to be an intellectual engagé.
It absolutely did. And that crisis forced these giants of French thought, Sartre, Camus, Beauvoir, Bourdieu, to stick their entire philosophical reputation on a single question. What is the fundamental responsibility of an intellectual when they are confronted with state-sponsored oppression?
So today we're confronting that dilemma directly. The central question is this: does genuine intellectual commitment demand a radical alignment with revolutionary forces, even accepting violence as a necessary mechanism for liberation? That's the position I'll be defending, one rooted in revolutionary necessity.
Or conversely, does moral integrity require prioritizing nonviolence and maintaining absolute ethical boundaries, especially against terror, regardless of who wields it? I'll be arguing for the primacy of moral restraint, following the intellectual line of figures like Albert Camus.
And I will maintain that when facing a colonial system that is itself built on violence, the intellectual's duty must prioritize the justice of liberation, embodying the kind of commitment championed by Sartre and Fanon.
Well, let me establish my ground immediately. While I fully acknowledge the systemic violence and exploitation inherent in French colonialism, the intellectual's ultimate responsibility is the unwavering refusal to justify terror. This is the existential line drawn by Albert Camus, who, being born in Algeria, he felt this crisis on a deeply personal level. His philosophy, rooted in The Rebel, warned that any revolutionary movement, no matter how noble its aims, risks replicating the very tyranny it seeks to destroy the moment it abandons moral limits.
That's an interesting point, but I see Camus' stance here as a kind of philosophical luxury, one that was simply unavailable to the oppressed. Our source material, particularly the economic data from just before the major conflict, it confirms Sartre's defining point. Colonialism is fundamentally a system of structural violence and economic exploitation. We can see the material reality of this in 1954. Algeria held a massive trade surplus with France, exporting 172.28 billion francs worth of goods while importing only 115.76 billion. That 56 billion franc gap, that isn't just a moral failing. It is structural theft. Therefore, active intellectual commitment, engagement, is required to dismantle this system, not just to passively critique it.
But when the intellectual endorses violence, they risk a kind of intellectual dishonesty, a form of mauvaise foi, bad faith, by, sitting safely in a Paris cafe while urging others into a bloody conflict. Camus' consistent appeals for a civil truce, his earlier chronicles of the war, they reflect the intellectual's proper duty to prevent immediate, concrete harm and to find a solution that spares the civilian population. The duty is always to the concrete human being, not to the abstract notion of a historical revolution.
I'm not convinced that focusing on abstract notions of nonviolence really serves the concrete reality of the oppressed. You speak of Camus upholding moral integrity, but the violence of the colonized, which was so often condemned by French intellectuals, is merely a necessary response to the overwhelming institutionalized terror of the colonial state. We have to locate the initial moral failure. The French state deployed over 400,000 troops to maintain a structure whose primary function was economic extraction, as we just saw in those 1954 trade figures. And when peace seemed maybe imminent, the anti-independence forces resorted to outright illegality. The 1961 military coup de force militaire, led by Generals Salan, Chalet, Zeller, and Jouhaux, tried to overthrow the civilian government. The moral contamination, the original sin of violence, lies squarely with the French system. The Algerian response, while tragic, was politically and ethically forced upon them.
I see why you want to shift the moral burden entirely onto the originators of the violence, but the intellectual must judge all acts of cruelty equally and universally. To maintain intellectual integrity, you simply cannot accept the premise that the end justifies the means. Yes, of course, the French military committed unspeakable acts. Claude Bourdet famously labeled them the Gestapo d'Algérie back in 1955, and Pierre-Henri Simon courageously documented the systematic use of torture in Contre la Torture. But condemning French actions does not morally license the FLN's violence, which also targeted innocent civilians, including pieds noirs, women, and children. And this is where Camus' dilemma becomes so profoundly instructive, moving beyond simple political alignment.
When he was asked to choose between justice for the Algerians and the safety of his own mother, who really represented the working-class pied noir also caught in the crossfire, his refusal to accept violence against innocents, that reflects the proper intellectual resistance to ideological dehumanization. That refusal isn't self-deception, it's moral clarity.
I would frame Camus's personal anguish, while completely understandable, as a profound intellectual limitation. Sartre or Beauvoir would argue that that kind of personal attachment risks blurring the larger political truth. You can't claim moral clarity while simultaneously refusing to endorse the tools necessary to dismantle the very system that created the violence in the first place. You are, in effect, asking the oppressed to fight with one hand tied behind their back, purely for the comfort of the metropolitan intellectual's conscience.
Well, but this brings us to the question of efficacy. Did that radical alignment, that embrace of insubordination, did it actually achieve the necessary political outcome, or did it risk shutting down necessary political channels? Your side advocated for radical commitment, which manifested in acts like the Manifesto of the 121, which endorsed draft dodging and illegality. My concern is that such actions risked isolating the intellectual community from the broader French public and diminishing their capacity for reform. Camus, through his documented journalism in the Chroniques Algériennes, he sought to compel France toward reform and recognition of the suffering of all populations involved, Arab and Pied Noir, by appealing to a universal humanism. He worked within the existing political structure, aiming for a negotiated solution for common ground. Wasn't that the more effective path to minimize suffering?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that moral pleas alone could have succeeded against such a deeply entrenched, state-sanctioned power structure. History demonstrates the failure of that moral approach. The French state, embodied by hardliners like Robert Lacoste, was committed to military solutions and the preservation of the colony regardless of the ethical cost. Appeals to humanism were, well, they were merely ignored or absorbed by a system committed to maintaining its own power. Radical action, therefore, was the only viable political commitment. The Manifesto of the 121 and the active material support provided by networks like the Janssen Network, which funneled substantial funds and operational aid directly to the FLN, these were not just symbolic gestures. They were necessary political disruptions. They translated abstract ethical outrage, the injustice of colonialism, into concrete actions that actively subverted the French state's war effort.
But you overlooked the political cost of that illegality. By endorsing networks that operated outside the law, the intellectual ceded all moral high ground in domestic French discourse. It allowed figures on the right to dismiss committed intellectuals as treasonous agents, thereby reducing their overall influence on necessary political reform, which, in the end, required a consensus within the French government to end the war.
Influence is meaningless if it doesn't change reality. The system of colonialism proved impervious to internal reform. Sartre, especially in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, he framed this action as the individual overcoming alienation through committed collective action. It was only by risking personal safety and reputation that the intellectual could achieve true political meaning. A moral appeal that fails to change material conditions is frankly an intellectual failure.
And that brings us to the core philosophical hinge, doesn't it? The deepest tension in this debate, the philosophical justification of violence itself. You rely so heavily on Fanon and Sartre, who see revolutionary violence not just as a necessary tactic, but as a path to psychological and ontological restoration.
Precisely. The deepest tension here lies in the understanding of freedom and existence itself. Decolonization, as Fanon argued, is not merely a political transfer of power. It is a violent rupture necessary to shatter the psychological reality imposed by the colonizer. I mean, think about the daily reality of the colonial subject. They're defined entirely as an object, rendered invisible, stripped of agency. They exist as an etcher en soi, a thing defined by external forces. Sartre championed this view, arguing that violence in the specific colonial context is the crucible to which the colonized subject achieves the être pour soi, being for itself by asserting radical sovereignty. It is the existential act of self-definition against a system built on total dehumanization. This philosophical requirement for self-emancipation, it justifies the revolutionary act as the ultimate necessary path to freedom. Without that rupture, the violence of colonialism just persists eternally.
That's a compelling and profound argument for the psychological transformative power of the revolutionary moment. But have you considered the intellectual and moral danger? Fanon's focus on restorative violence risks turning existential freedom into a totalitarian ideology. It's a slippery slope that Camus warned against throughout his work. The attempt to justify revolutionary violence, dialectically claiming that violence today leads to liberation tomorrow, is the very logic that leads to accepting the terror. The pursuit of that utopian end risks sacrificing all moral restraints in the present. Camus' philosophy and the rebel stands as a perpetual guardrail against exactly this. The intellectual mandate is to focus on the limitations of action, emphasizing the shared human condition and refusing to become a voyou, a hoodlum, in the name of historical necessity.
But that shared human condition you appeal to is exactly what the colonial system sought to erase for the indigenous population. To refuse violence when the colonial state is violence is not maintaining a moral boundary. It's advocating for the indefinite preservation of the colonial system. The intellectual's role must be to identify and support the radical reestablishment of human rights, even if that process is inherently bloody.
Yet, the intellectual cannot claim to uphold justice while simultaneously sanctioning acts that defy any universal standard of decency. When you abandon the critique of cruelty, even temporarily, you lose the ability to critique the new power structure once it is established. You risk locking the oppressed into a continuous cycle of violence. The moral integrity of the intellectual requires permanent, unrelenting skepticism toward power, regardless of its source or justification.
We have certainly illuminated the deep and at times irreconcilable tensions that define this era for French thinkers. My position remains fixed on the necessity of political liberation against the systemic violence of colonialism. I believe that a radical endorsement of revolutionary means was the only meaningful form of intellectual commitment, translating philosophical outrage into political reality, as demonstrated by Sartre and the network of activists he supported.
And I maintain that the intellectual's duty is immutable, that it lies in the unwavering critique of terror and the defense of universal human limits. The path taken by Camus, Baudet, and others prioritized moral clarity and the prevention of immediate cruelty, rejecting the dialectical justification of violence even when that violence was intended for justice.
This discussion really shows the inherent tragedy of the intellectual in a time of total war. The simultaneous demand for absolute moral purity clashing with the practical, violent demands of political history. Both sides were sincerely held and driven by a deep concern for justice, yet they offered fundamentally different paths to achieving it.
Indeed, the profound disagreement over engagement during the Algerian War leaves the listener with a difficult question. Does one fight for the future at the expense of the present moral order, or does one defend the present ethical minimum, even if it prolongs a necessary historical struggle? There is clearly so much more to explore in the material regarding how these philosophical commitments translated into concrete actions and devastating consequences on the ground.